We'll begin with Semyo. Semyo is an assistant professor of Korean literature and visual culture in the Department of East Asian Languages and Literature at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She received her PhD from Columbia University and is currently working on a project that looks into the visual and sound cultures of colonial Seoul, entitled Seoul Streets, Surface Matters, Speech Matters.
Can you hear me more back okay? I'd like to thank the GSD and the Korea Institute for hosting this event, and special thanks to Melanie, who has tirelessly worked to make this event happen. And it is so great to see so many familiar faces from my postdoc year in 2008 across from the street. I'm going to tackle this whole question of history in my presentation, or try to at least, but to where the historians had for the moment, the textual space or colonial Seoul that I speak of is mainly in the 1920s and 30s. So it comes after Ellie's presentation and Lee Kwang-soo's Mujang of 1917, and obviously before Jimmy's presentation of post-liberation. So my presentation does not necessarily deal with the wartime tradition from 1940s, so I would like you to keep that in mind. So to begin, our workshop title is Unbuilding Colonial Space in Korea, 1910 to 1945. So I draw my methodology from this history of building and unbuilding of Seoul. I hope my presentation today is not too schematic or abstract, but instead of speaking of what Seoul was like from 1910 to 1945, I would like to explore the potential that the city offers in rethinking the colonial history of Korea. So I'll mostly focus on methodological questions about how to read the city and try to unpack this very process of building and unbuilding. The vantage point that I take in studying the colonial past of Korea is through the material traces that are visible, buried, and disappearing in the sprawling urban space of Seoul today. So I build, looking for clues as to how the city of Seoul in the modern form began. But I do so with full awareness that any attempt at building is necessarily a deconstructive endeavor in search of a city that folds and unfolds against itself. So I will explore two questions today. One is how the city interacts with history. This question involves an investigation of how the city evolved, the very process of its existence, as well as reading the writing of history in space. The latter approach takes historical time as the function of space, and I will try to show that the very notion of history was an outcome of the colonial spatial practice in Seoul. Secondly, my focus is on the question of subjectivity. I will try to read against the idea that colonial subjectivity was docile, oppressed, and submissive, but situate the colonial subjectivity squarely in the context of modernity. In doing so, I hope to mirror back on our own petitionality of looking back at the past in the mire of historical constraints and possibilities. Throughout my presentation, I will refer to Seoul during the colonial period simply as Seoul rather than colonial Seoul. Seoul under Japanese rule was called Keijo, a demoted status from Hanyang, the capital of the Joseon dynasty. Hanyang, Keijo, and Seoul. These names inevitably refer back to the political powers that rationalize space into an urban form and highlight the historical ruptures from the Joseon dynasty to Japanese colonialism and to post-liberation South Korea. By simply referring to Seoul as Seoul, I do not wish to take an ahistorical approach. Rather, I wish to see the city as a space and a text where the history can be unpacked. Instead of following the trajectory of the historical change that the city of Seoul underwent from 1392 to today, I take Seoul as a method through which that way of reading history can be seen in a different light. In short, I approach Seoul as a discursive space. This is an attempt to read the writing of history in the urban space rather than trace historical changes of that space. As I connect the dots between the city and the colonial logic of power, I take modernity not as a condition that was brought about by urbanization, but as a process through which colonial power discursively formulated itself. So in this presentation, I will lay out how the knowledge about modernity was produced through the urban space, form, and practice of Seoul. This question of epistemology is what frames our historical discussion today. So rather than take history as a methodology of investigating urban space, I take urban space as a methodology of studying history. There are different ways of describing Seoul, and I use three premises. One, it was the capital city. Two, it was a colonial city. Three, it was a modern city. Seoul as a capital city complicated the colonizing process as it provided an intricate template for the colonizer to work with and against. As Seoul was turned into a shadow capital by the Japanese colonizers, it became a colonial city that served as a center for the colonial administration and commerce, where the colonizing process took place symbolically and physically. And thirdly, and most importantly, Seoul was a modern city. For this, I refer to the descriptions of the city offered by a Japanese traveler in the 1920s, which was published in a Japanese language magazine. In this piece, he wrote his impressions of Honmaji, the commercial district in the Japanese residential area, and compared it to Ginza of Tokyo. He marveled at the amenities and conveniences befitting of a modern city, a colonial city with ease in the hustle and bustle created by streetcars, streetlights, and telephones, and in the vibrant mood of young women and couples strolling under the neon lights. These familiar sights to a metropolitan subject in a colony offered an eerie resemblance to his home Tokyo and caused discomfort. So after writing his admiration, he went on to criticize modernity of Seoul as a product of imitation and a culture without foundation. How do we make sense of the estrangement that this Japanese onlooker felt looking at Seoul? How do we explain the material condition of modernity in the context of urbanization and colonization of Seoul? Is modernity inherently incompatible with colonialism? Should we see urbanization as an unintended outcome of Japanese colonialism because it was meant to unevenly benefit Japanese residents? Or should we resort to the apologist rhetoric that Japan modernized Korea, diffusing contentious questions about the colonial past? And how did Koreans see the city changing in front of their eyes at a rapid pace, and what was modernity to them? Rather than treating these competing facets of Seoul being a capital city, a colonial city, and modern city as inherently contradictory to one another, I would like to map out the ways in which they come to interact as mutually reinforcing logic. And I locate the sites where all these elements converge on the surface matters of the city, different layers of the city that are material, visual, textual, and yes, imaginary. The reason why surface matters are important in Seoul is because Seoul under Japanese rule was to serve as a showcase city. It was turned into a spectacle whose goal was to impress with monumental architecture, visualizing a historical break, colonial domination, and universal aspiration for the future all at the same time. And yet, the reason why Seoul's urbanization came to focus on surface matters can also be found in the history of Seoul as a capital city. Comprehensive urban planning in a city that was built on Neo-Confucian ideology was a difficult task. So before the Great Keijo urban planning of 1936, earlier urban reform projects of 1912 and 1919 mainly focused on building new structures and rearranging the roads. When we look at the distribution of new buildings, we find a peculiar process that bifurcates the city into a dual space along the Chung-hee stream. Again, this was a process that accommodated the organic growth of the settler community and colonial organization. The competition of the Japanese migrants at the turn of the century was mainly small merchants who came to Korea before the colonial administration. So when they arrived in Seoul, they found themselves settling in an area at the foothill of the Nam Mountain, formerly populated by Chinese merchants. Located in the outskirts of the city, it was called Muddy Hills because it was prone to frequent flooding in the summer. This area, topographically harsh and in the periphery of the city, would compete with the former center as the colonial government concentrated modern amenities and commercial apparatuses for Japanese settlers. This resulted in the most prominent feature of Seoul under Japanese rule. The former center came to be known as North Village and the new center as the South Village. This spatial bifurcation along ethnic and political lines has come to symbolize what was most colonial about Seoul and has dominated the recent scholarship of colonial Seoul and Korea. Just looking at the photograph here, one might be tempted to locate the center in the North Village because that is where the most potent symbols of colonial dominance were. The government general headquarters building was hovering alongside the police station, the courthouse, and the prison. But I would like to argue that the question of coloniality is not a matter of locating the nexus of power, but of recognizing the importance of visual representation. The center does not connote a place where political apparatuses were concentrated, that is, the North Village, but rather a process of producing the representation of modernity by re-signifying the space. This is why Honmachi, that the government general's headquarters building, becomes the center, signifying the new with a spectacular vision of modernity in architecture, commodity, and fashion. This also means that the most colonial feature of the city does not lie in the separation between the North Village and the South Village, but in the recentering of the city. The North Village was not cast out a modernization project, but it was pressed into a relation with the South Village as its other. In particular, Jongno, the Korean commercial district, was modernized in emulation of Honmachi. Therefore, speaking of the binary relation between the colonizer and the colonized does not entail orientalizing the native. How the native town became museums preserving the essence of the Orient. This kind of Oriental quarter, dirty and disorderly as opposed to clean and orderly colonial settlement, was not the most notable feature of Seoul. Rather than relying on the exclusion of its Oriental other, the process of othering in Seoul depended upon accentuating the newness and the modernness of Honmachi. That means the colonial other was made to mirror the colonizer, so the gaze here is that of desire for the modern, desire for the new, and desire for the future. The so-called museumification of Korean sector was limited to the palaces, through which the colonizer hoped to deny the political validity of the Korean monarchy by rendering the palaces into material ruins and by freezing their symbolic potential in time. That means the most important aspect in this bifurcation of Seoul was the visualization of time, in which the binary was not that of closing up the old other, but of enticing it to a relation with the new, so that two different temporalities can be co-figured in one space. Unlike Honmachi in the South Village, where these new buildings formed a cluster of a district-like zone, key governmental buildings in Colonial Seoul, key governmental buildings in the North Village were scattered around it, depending on where the former monarchical palaces were located. They had specific monumental qualities and were built directly on the grounds or in close proximity to the monarchical symbols. The government general's headquarters building began its construction in 1916, shortly after the 1915 industrial exhibition, during which a large portion of the palace was gutted out, and later the front gate, the Gwanghwamun, was moved to clear the view of this imposingly elaborate structure. It occupied 30,000 pyeong that had formerly belonged to the Gyeongbok Palace, as a surviving audience hall and pavilion stood dwarfed by this new imposing structure. The Changyong Palace, which was located next to Sunjong's residence at the Changnam Palace, was first to be desacralized in 1908, as it was turned into a recreational space housing a museum, a botanical garden, and a zoo. Another royal residence, the Gyeongbok Palace, which has served as the hub for Gojo's modernization project from the Joseon Empire, was made to face the new city hall built across from it. Here, erasure describes the process of rewriting the ideological imprints of the former dynasty by Japanese colonialism. On the one hand, the construction of new monumental architecture for Japanese colonialism on palace grounds was a powerful way of visualizing colonial violence and its dominance over space. But a more imperative point lies in the fact that this process did not result in the complete removal of the old structures to the extent that the old was expunged from the present template of the city. Rather, the new was purposely superimposed onto the existing fabric of the city to make visible the act of erasing. In erasure, a peculiar juxtaposition of the new and the old left traces of colonial rewriting of the space. It was not simply to flaunt colonial power, but to inscribe a specific kind of temporality in which the past and the future were visualized through the tectonic power of architecture. In other words, erasure coalesced and made visible two distinct temporalities in one space, one pointing to the universal time of modernity, and the other to a particular time located in the past. This was historical narrative built on teleology, and in this scheme of history, Japan and Korea were to occupy two places in the linear progression of time. Japan was model, and Korea was to mirror the modernity while lagging behind. This was where colonial difference was located, not in ethnic or racial difference, because difference in temporal terms would deny the possibility for locality to narrow national time, but always to be subsumed under the colonial in the guise of the universal. At this point, I would like to go back to the comment that the Japanese traveler made about Seoul being a replica of Tokyo. What made him reminisce about his hometown was not what we would recognize as culturally specific Japanese features in the Seoul landscape, but an inescapable familiarity between the two because of their modernness. As various colonial and modernization projects rapidly transformed Seoul, it became not a Korean city, Japanese city, or Asian city, but a modern city that exhibited familiar forms and expressions of universal modernity in visual forms. They signified Japan doubly as global and local, and Seoul offered itself as an interlinking point of global modernity of urban centers, while representing Japanese colonialism ambiguously figured as universal and colonial. Through the signs of universal modernity, the monumental architecture narrated utopian dreams of Japanese imperialism. So what the Japanese observer foresaw as a lack of cultural particularity of Seoul was not a product of undisciplined imitation or unsophisticated understanding of culture, but of an outcome of Japanese colonialism operating by simulation. In material and commodity forms, the various signs of modernity seen in Seoul stood in for the real without specific reference to its origin in place or time, and create a world where the question about faithfulness to origin mattered very little. It would be a mistake, however, to think of colonial subjectivity in this context merely as a spectator who would uncritically open himself or herself up to the endless replication of images. Instead, I propose that as much as Japanese colonial discourse depended upon the logical articulation of modernity, the colonial subjectivity under the address was also supposed to be a rational, self-reflexive subjectivity. I would like to underscore that this was the desired colonial subjectivity who would convert visuality into discursively formulated thinking. And the textual reading of the city took place on surface levels, where ornamentality endowed architecture with semantic dimension and elevated the space of occupancy to a moral and aesthetic concept. Ornamentality was a tool that searched for the zeitgeist not as a reference for reality, but a concept, which is a simulation of meaning. The task of the onlooker was to seamlessly narrate the continuity between the main body of architecture and the supplementary parts. In traversing the aesthetic and the rational, the colonial logic of power would rest upon the subject, would create narrative from the discontinuous amalgam of images, an abstract meaning in the copies of ornaments. In this way, the surface matters of architecture become a medium through which the urban dwellers interpret the city, and the city becomes a reflective space. This way of colonizing through modernity was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, colonization was not to be a coercive process, but to operate on the production and mobilization of subjects who would voluntarily participate in the colonizing process through the shared goal of modernization. And this is the reason why we see such a split, where the erasure specifically targeted monarchies, since Korea or Koreans were to be mobilized into the Japanese Empire. But this colonial subject was split into the future-oriented gaze and the self-alienating gaze, which disavows the particular in the name of the universal. So this subject is perpetually suspended in this juncture, where the goal of history is not a matter of time, but continuously escapes the grasp of the colonized. Reading Seoul as a historical narrative and a colonial discourse reveals that modernity was part and parcel of Japanese colonialism, because outside of modernity, colonial power and colonial difference could not have been articulated. Here, modernity is not a discrete historical stage, but a process of foreclosure that limits the possibility of the alternative. In modernity, the universal displays the particular, and for this reason, it is utopia and colonial at the same time. Utopia orients people toward a future that does not belong in history, and the promise of the future without revolution not only denies meaningful political participation, but also suspends the colonized from the elusive endpoint in the progression of time and eventually thrusts them out of history. These are the key tenets of coloniality in Seoul, because utopia exists in a cultural void, and modernity was, in a sense, phantasmagoric, a resident posture, simulation, and a kit. It compressed time and space in narrating the history of empire and colony in universal terms, for which the semblance of order was to be achieved by associating architecture with certain events, time, people, and style taken out of their own context. That means self-alienation was an outcome of self-reflection, an outcome of the exercise of rational faculty, and rational faculty an outcome of the modern urban subject. In this way, the boundary between the colonial and the modern becomes indistinct, because the colonial subject's desire for the universal was precisely what alienated the subject from the promise of the universal. In many accounts in Korean language literature from this period, we encounter Koreans marveling about the allure of unmatching and looking at Chung-hee with shame. These seemingly uncritical responses to the colonial city and fracture are reminiscent of the ways in which we historians of Korea often talk about the teleological trajectory of colonial and postcolonial divides. We stand in the same epistemological impasse as the colonial subjective in gazing, decoding, and looking away from the colonial language of power, while taking nostalgia in someone else's past and yearning for the future in utopia. So I argue, any effort of recuperating the historical possibility for the colonial subject must not lie in the passing or recovering of time, but in the critical inquiry into the very logic that allowed this estrangement to take place, namely the logic of identity. For me, the city flattens that history for another look, so that we are not entrapped by its allure and order, at least for the time being. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Wong. So our last speaker for this afternoon, last but definitely not least, is Jeannie Kim Watson. Jeannie Kim Watson is Associate Professor of English and Comparative Literature at NYU, New York University. She received a PhD in Literature from Duke in 2006. Jeannie also received her bachelor's degree in architecture from the University of Melbourne. So it's good to have another person from the Antipodes, Australia.
From the architecture.
Her research focuses on the literature and culture of the Asia Pacific, comparative modernities, theories of architecture and urbanism, and questions of political modernity. She is the author of The New Asian City, Three-Dimensional Fictions of Space and Urban Form, and has published on postcolonial space and literature in postcolonial studies, contemporary literature, and positions, East Asia cultures.
Thank you. Oh, that was impressive. Turn up.
I don't have a lot of control over it.
Oh no, I just meant right. Oh. Thank you. After that graceful beginning. Thank you so much, Melanie, for inviting me. I'm excited to be here with such esteemed co-panelists. And thank you also to the Korea Institute and to the GSD. It's been a long time since I've been in an architecture school, so it's nice to be back. I feel like a little bit of an outsider for this particular group. I come not from the sophistication and the depth of Korean studies. So I also I feel like for the Korean studies people, I hope my history is good enough, and for the architecture people, I hope my design analysis is enough. It's probably not going to be fun either. Thank you. All right. I'm also the only speaker that's going to speak about the post-colonial period. So I guess that makes me the in the title, unbuilding. I begin today then with the question of how Japanese colonial space has been unbuilt in post-colonial South Korea. We've heard very elegantly from Sammy about this building already. There are, of course, several ways one can approach this question. A first might be the literal unbuilding of particular buildings and urban forms. A perfect example is the Governor General's building, seat of Japanese colonial power, which was constructed, of course, in the very front yard of the Korean royal palace, Gyeongbokgung, effectively blocking the latter from the city and its landmark, Ganghamun Gate. Not incidentally, however, the building was also the seat of power for both the US military government from 1945 to 48 and the South Korean government from 1962 to 82. Nevertheless, it was long argued to be a painful reminder of Korea's colonial past and was demolished in 1995 with no little fanfare. On August 15th, Korean Independence Day, the dome of the building was cut off. We might say the building itself was castrated, and it is now displayed in the Independence Hall of Korea as a symbol of Korean independence. So the unbuilding of Korean colonial space in this case can take on quite specific and spectacular dimensions. Another route would be to focus on the question of styles, and we saw something of this in Professor An Chang-mo's comments in the video. Along these lines, we could assess the ways Japanese colonial architectural education eschewed ornamentation, for example, and track the ways this did or didn't influence architectural practice in the post-colonial period. And both of these approaches are, I think, enormously interesting and necessary for understanding the topic at hand. Yet a third way of approaching the question would be to look instead at the unbuilding of a spatial system or an ideology of space. And this is what I intend to pursue in my paper. Rather than sites or buildings themselves as empirical objects in space, or the question of architectural stylistic influence, I'm interested in the logic and form of colonial space and how these persist or are transformed in the post-colonial period. In this sense, the space making of the colonial era is not just about individual buildings of the Japanese empire, and of course we've seen this in all of the papers today, but also the global relationships and hierarchies that are both symbolically represented and engendered by such space-making. It is this broader meaning of colonial space-making that informs my reading of post-colonial Korean urbanism and architecture. How does the post-colonial era contend with histories and ideologies of space that cannot be solved by simply demolishing the offensive structures? My presentation will be in 3 short sections. First, a brief account of the spatial logic of the export production zone and its economic role in South Korea in the 1960s and 70s. This is followed by a necessarily truncated literary reading of a very well-known 1978 novella by writer Cho Se-hee. And finally, I'll end with an examination of some speeches and writings by President Park Chung-hee, who was, of course, in power from 1961 to 79, for the way that his policies inscribe and figure post-colonial Korean space. In all 3 sections, I'm interested in the way post-colonial South Korea has been overdetermined by narratives of its growth, of urban forms, of density, population, industries, exports, and GDPs. How might we rethink such an emphasis on growth using a post-colonial analytic? Okay, so the first section is on the export production zone as the blank slate. Much ink has been spilled on the miracle on the Han River, South Korea's stunning economic rise that began during the Park Chung-hee years. As one of the original Asian tiger economies, Korea, and I'm just going to say Korea from now on, although of course I'm meaning South Korea as in distinction from North Korea. So Korea is popularly understood as one of the Asian tigers to have pulled itself out of third world conditions by following Japan's economic formula of developing manufacturing industries for export production and by achieving astounding levels of worker productivity. And of course the problematic shorthand for that is Confucian capitalism. I want to argue, however, that one of the ways a small state like Korea was able to climb its way into the list of high GDP earners was through a particular manipulation of national space, and especially via the innovation of the Export Production Zone, or EPZ, also known as Free Trade Zone or Industrial Park. Invented in the 1950s and pioneered by Asian tigers Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore, it is the ultimate spatial expression of export-driven industrialization. Dependency theorist Andre Gunder-Frank early described the essence of its spatial logic. A flat piece of land is supplied with the necessary infrastructure, factory buildings and productive equipment, and the materials that are to be processed are to be brought in from afar, often from the other side of the globe. The labour to process these materials is supplied from the surrounding rural or urban areas. The archetype of this new industrial development is the free production or export promotion zone, which specialises in producing textiles and electronic components for the export to the world market. Poor in natural resources and with its large post-war urban population, Korea required both massive rebuilding and major new industries to absorb and stabilise its population. The EPZ was the perfect solution to all these problems. A 1988 report by the International Labour Organization concurs that the appeal of the EPZ lies in its blank slate character. Quote, the EPZ as planner's dream, end quote. It avoids traditional obstacles, local histories, and poorly functioning infrastructure by literally starting from scratch. What is important to recognise here is how this spatial logic of the blank slate has informed the broader nature of urban growth and renewal in South Korea. In other words, it determines the corresponding spatial system by which the labour, that is the people, to process these materials is supplied from the surrounding rural or urban areas. As the economists note, export production does not just result in isolated EPZs, but these zones must form part of an overall countrywide export-oriented development strategy. In other words, such reorganisation entails a myriad of social and spatial transformations, including massive country-to-city migration, government-urban renewal schemes, the prevalence of factory labour, the mass mobilisation of women into the workforce, as well as the introduction of high-rise apartment dwelling and new domestic arrangements of space. And we can see something of the blank slate character of high-rise apartment development here. So this is one obvious answer to what the architecture of rapid economic development looks like. Moreover, as we know from studies of colonial space-making, treatment of the city as tabula rasa space is emphatically not new. The Japanese already fundamentally reorganized Seoul along Western rationalist planning principles and began its economic orientation outward towards the empire, an orientation which, for the post-colonial period, becomes production for the world market. And one precursor for the EPZ is, of course, the Colonial exhibition. In other words, if the colonial city is the node which helps to produce global imperialism, that is, it produces the relationship between Imperial Japan and colonial Joseon, we can understand that EPZ is part of a new spatial system that helps produce the new international division of labour that reshaped the world after World War II. The distinct form of the EPZ is thus both an attempt to overcome the underdeveloped industrial conditions of colonialism and a continuity of some of its principles. Okay. And my second section is on Chung-hee and the dwarf. But I'm not telling a story that relies on economic history as the master determinant of post-colonial space. If such dramatic industrial growth has been much lauded as the key ingredient to the Korean miracle, how were these new spatial and urban systems actually experienced and lived? And we heard very elegantly from Ellie about the use of literature as another kind of narrative of space. As we learn from Henri Lefebvre and other theorists of space, such transformations are always ongoing, partial, uneven, and contested. How might a literary text tell a different story of the Korean miracle? Seoul's remarkable post-war rebuilding has often been told as a simple, one-dimensional story of economic success. And we see this in a multitude of studies, and for example in a comment by architectural critic Jeffrey Kipnis, who described Seoul's post-war urban development as, quote, an ugly, sprawling urban monster, true enough, but a money machine that buried South Korea in cash, end quote. Or, from my own discipline of post-colonial literary studies, critic Simon Gakandi can speak of Japan and Korea as if they were interchangeable examples, as, quote, leaders in a new narrative of global capital, end quote. It is as a powerful counter-narrative to this kind of logic that I read Chung-hee's groundbreaking novella depicting the dark side of Korea's urban and industrial growth, A Little Bowl launched by a dwarf, Nanjanga Solo in Chagango. The title story of a 1978 collection, Cho's work became unofficial required reading for the following generation of college students and labour activists. Literary critic Kim Yoon-sik writes that at a time when little dissent about the nation's prospects was tolerated, it was Chung-hee who bravely posed the question of, quote, what there would be on the other side of the seemingly bright future promised by industrialization, end quote. Recall that following the devastation of the Civil War and with the influx of refugees from the north and displaced rural dwellers, post-war Seoul had swelled to 2.5 million people. In the 1960s, approximately 1/3 of the city consisted of squatter housing. By the end of the decade, the government had responded with publicly financed high-rise apartment buildings. Urban historians Chu Chul Kim and Sang Chul Che report that one of the earliest high-rise apartment buildings collapsed in 1970, killing 32 people. A very traumatic introduction to this new architectural form. By the 1970s, the government began sponsoring slum clearance projects in high-rise housing using for-profit private construction contracts rather than public funds. Cho's novella is set precisely in this painful, if defining, moment of Seoul's spatial history. And so just to briefly describe the narrative. A Little Ball revolves around the family of dwarf protagonist Kim Buri as the marginalised human remainder left over from the nation's rush to modernise. Together with his wife and 3 children, Yongsoo, Yonghol and Yonghee, he exists day to day on factory work and odd jobs and occupies an unregistered muhoga shack in a squatter settlement, presumably located on the outskirts of Seoul. With the help of interspersed flashbacks, we are told the story of the imminent demolition of the family's home by the city government for the construction of new high-rise apartment complexes. Kim and Chair have described how, in the procedure of urban renewal, displaced squatter families were issued with occupancy rights to the new apartments. However, as rental and moving in costs were prohibitively high for most squatters, their only option was to sell their housing rights illegally to middle-class purchasers or brokers and relocate in shanty towns even further from the city centre. This ultimately led to unprecedented levels of real estate speculation, especially on the south side of the Han River. Of course, this is the origin of the affluent area of Gangnam, recently popularised in a rather different medium. Aside from narrating the blatant injustice of this process, A Little Ball can be read as an attempt to render these new spaces and structures legible to the subjects around them in terms of larger national and economic, social transformations. The factory work that the two sons, Yong-soo and Yong-ho, are forced into after quitting school is narrated as nothing but a zero-sum game between the growth of the company and that of the individual. Written in a deceptively simple, rhythmic Korean, the language itself seems stunted or incomplete, echoing the diminished status of the slum dwellers' lives. We were limited to 30 minutes for lunch. We worked in the same factory but led an isolated existence there. Everyone in the factory worked in isolation. They kept us at a distance from each other, no socialising, and all we did was drip with sweat. We worked into the middle of the night in stuffy, noisy environment. And so, although we were still growing, we exhibited growth deficiencies. Quite literally, the energy that is needed for the workers' own growth is siphoned off into economic growth for the company and the larger imperatives of the national economy. They are physically reduced by the continued increases in work hours, and their growth stunted for the maximisation of productivity. The word used by the company president to instill fear and discipline in the workers is recession, highlighting the opposing criteria for human and economic growth. When the two boys manage to form a labour union and organise a strike, they are betrayed by the other workers and fired. But it is daughter Yong-hee who most directly confronts the contradictions of the growing economy under the Park Chung-hee regime, largely driven by state-backed conglomerates or chaebols. As the family nervously monitors the illegal market for the best time to sell their housing rights, a man in a sedan appears at the Squatter Settlements District office and buys up all the remaining titles. Though never named, he is evidently the son of a wealthy family who runs a real estate and construction company, most likely a chaebol conglomerate. While his main business is selling new apartments on the south side of the Han River, he picks up extra profits by illegally brokering urban renewal occupancy rights. Noticing his interest in her, Yong-hee agrees to prostitute himself to him in order to steal back the family's housing rights. After secretly securing the housing right documents from him along with cash and a knife, Yong-hee must then register her family's occupancy at the site office of the chaebol company's new apartment buildings, again on the south side of the river. What's remarkable in this scene is that the architectural form of the high-rise itself is narrated as the social antagonist. Cho's breathless and disjunctive narrative is pared down here to the minimum of syntax and vocabulary. After emerging from the Namsan tunnel and across the third Han River Bridge, his apartment building standing in an open field came into sight. I opened my handbag and felt his knife inside. At the top of the ivory handle was a small metal attachment the size of a bead. Press it and the blade shot out. I had the taxi stop in front of the Housing Affairs office. Numerous people were walking toward the entrance. I hurriedly worked my way among them, and then I was carried forward, carried by the people to the plaza in front of the building. The white building reflected the sunlight, dazzling my eyes. At this scene of Yong-hee's final heroic action, his apartment building in effect stands in for the chaebol son himself, and perhaps we also have here another potential scene of architectural castration. In stark contrast to the descriptions of the family's squatter village located in the shadow of a brick factory, this building throws out a blinding glare to all who approach. Yong-hee's relationship with the chaebol son is thus repeated metonymically through the apprehension of the apartment building. It is the most tangible physical expression of the masculine estate and chaebol-led development. In the schema of A Little Ball, then, the two classes of people exhibit a metonymic relationship to two kinds of dwellings and to two architectural aesthetics. The gleaming modern apartment building dominates the open field, like the chaebols dominate the national economy, while the shabby hand-constructed house is, like the squatter community, finally reduced to dust. The connection between inhabitants' body and house is confirmed when Chung-hee returns to the squatter village to find both the family house demolished and her father dead. We can conclude then that if the EPZ and massive urban towers are the architectural corollaries of rapid industrial development, so too are the squatter villages that provided the cheap labour for the nation's economic growth and received its displaced urban squatters. And this is a slide of the Guangzhou Grand Complex, which was an incredibly poorly planned government idea of simply placing displaced squatter settlers even further outside, where there were absolutely no services or anything else. And today this is the satellite town of Seoul. I read this story not merely for the social conditions that it daringly narrates, but also for what it tells us about the nature of space under the developmental push of Park Chung-hee. At its most obvious level, the novella is about the literal shrinkage of a certain section of society for the growth of another. So obviously it's about the dwarf and his family. And yet it also shows how space is always contested. Space is always social space. To recall Henri Lefebvre's seminal study, The Production of Space, space is not a thing, but a relationship between things, classes, genders, political forces, and building types. The extraordinary discrepancy between national and individual growth is resolved at the narrative level by the figure of the looming high-rise apartment building. It is the massive architectural body which both destroys the dwarf's home and adds wealth to the national economy. Okay, my third and final section is Park Chung-hee and national reconstruction. This was Park Chung-hee on the day of the coup, May 16, 1961. More than anything else, the presidency of Park Chung-hee from 1961 until his assassination in 1979 stressed the physical development of South Korea in terms of a single national project. Numerous political and economic studies of Park's rule have traced his authoritarian style to his training in Manchurian, Japanese, and Korean military academies, and note his service as a lieutenant in the Japanese Kwantung Army. While Park certainly studied the Japanese model of a strong state business, or chaebol, alliance, and export-oriented industrialization, the incredible growth and productivity of the working masses cannot be explained by this industrial model alone. I follow Kim Hyung-ah's astute analysis in arguing that Park was most successful in steering the country towards an efficient labour system in which the ideas of construction and reconstruction of the nation were mobilised simultaneously at physical, national and psychic levels. Kim Hyung-ah describes how Park cannily tapped into the liberal public discourse that flourished in the year of civilian rule preceding the military coup that brought him to power in 1961. Based on the apparently shameful history of Korean dependence, first to the Chinese, then to the Japanese, and now to the Americans, and the embarrassment of national division, the reconstruction of a new dynamic Korean nation became paramount. Park thus rechanneled desires for a new independent nation into a state-led effort, characterized by both US-backed anti-communism and the single-minded goal of developing Korean exports. And this was a new building for the Supreme Association for National Rebuilding. And we can note here just first the typical international style that this is built in. It reminds us, of course, of the generalized appeal of modernist architecture across the developing world at this time. This building also happens to be the US Embassy in Seoul now. But also just to note how reconstruction was also explicitly figured in militarized terms. So this is the Reconstruction Corps. The mediator between the domestic and international terms of Park's project was the total modernization of the built environment, which could be held up as an emblem of national progress. Importantly, this was not limited to the Seoul region. His New Village movement, the Seoul Undong, begun in 1970, was a perfect encapsulation of the belief that with hard work and basic building materials, a physically and spiritually new Korea could be achieved. The New Village movement was, in essence, a program of rural industrialization in which the government provided villages with quantities of cement and reinforcing bar and encouraged them to construct roads, bridges and riverbanks. By 1973, this had become part of the broader Yushin, or revitalizing reforms, a nationwide program of self-improvement built on Park's twin tenets of anti-communism and economic nationalism. In a 1972 speech called the Seoul Undong, the New Mind movement, Park explicitly equates the modernization of houses and roads with the reconstruction of the Korean spirit. I think that the Seoul Undong should begin above all with a fresh spirit. As the old straw roofs of our farmhouses are replaced, so should our hearts be renewed with a fresh community spirit of diligence, independence and cooperation. As our narrow country roads are expanded and repaired, so should our hearts be filled with a new determination to pave a smoother future for our own families and our nation. The Seoul Undong will provide impetus to achieve a consistent national consensus which is required for the modernization of our fatherland. Underpinning this verbosity was the single most important metaphor for Park, the development of roads as the future path for our families and our nation. With this, we witness something like the Corbusian or modernist desire to effect revolutionary social change through a change in the built environment. In another speech urging a second liberation, of course the first being from the Japanese in 1945, he directly links the maintenance of peace with national power. Park concentrates on the concrete evidence of such power. Having expedited our progress in growth and construction thus far, we have just entered the stage of heavy and chemical industries. Functioning as the main artery linking all industrial complexes throughout the country, the expressways, symbols of our expanding national strength, are continuously pouring vitality into our effort for greater prosperity and development. In Park's logic, peace is a function of national strength, again concretized and visualized by a grand nationalized transport system as the latter's main artery. Park's vision is thus of a modernized Korea that, as he says elsewhere, will be able to emerge as a great nation state and final victor to join the main currents of world history. Most interesting here is that in Park's fantasy, it is Korea's exports rather than Koreans themselves that will allow for the nation to join the main currents of world history, thereby overcoming its shameful history of colonial subordination. The liberating movement of exports depends then on the industrialization of villages and the frenzied construction of roads, the overlaying of national space with a complete transportation grid, a circulatory system for the national body, facilitating the efficient combination of goods, materials, labour and finished commodities to their final destination on the world market. Economic and infrastructural development is thus merged with national destiny. If economic development was seen as casting off of Korea's shameful history of colonialism and dependence, the unique conditions of the country's decolonisation, the divided peninsula arrested at the very moment of decolonisation, further contributed to Park's leverage via the creation of the South Korean national security state. And this is Park initiating a construction project on Yeouido, and I sort of love the Cold War imagery of this. I'm not sure what happens when you press the button. Something started. Under the Yushin reforms, as is now well documented, Park increased his power to that of a dictator, such that the National Assembly became a mere rubber stamp, unions, universities, churches and the media were put under surveillance by the Korean CIA, the riot police were used to control the students, and a network of spies infiltrated the population to control public opinion. Meanwhile, the many government slogans of the day stressed national unity and hard work, such as construction on the one hand and national defense on the other, 일명건설, 일명국방, and our national land with our strength, 우리의 국토는 우리의 힘으로. The national spirit was thus assumed to lie in the very acts of construction, which would build the economic and military viability of the country. The extraction of disciplined labour for national reconstruction was thus also achieved by levying production targets in the name of national competition for prosperity. In another speech, Park openly invited North Korea to, quote, participate in a competition, a bona fide competition in development, in construction and creativity, end quote. And this is the Seoul export tower, which has on one side the target of export dollars in American dollars, 3.5, that's the equivalent of $1 billion US dollars. And then on the other side, how the progress that was made towards that goal. Let us not forget that funding for Korea's military and much of its infrastructure was also acquired through the looming presence of the Communist North. According to Bruce Cummings, a total of $13 billion in US economic and military aid was received by the South Korea between 1945 and 79. And of this mention must be made of the South Korea-US agreement, which sent 300,000 Koreans to fight in the Vietnam War in return for US President Johnson's pledge for assistance in constructing the Gyeongbu Expressway, which we just saw earlier. In sum, the relative miracle of Korea's economic takeoff years in the 1960s and 70s must be weighed against recognition of its specific internal conditions, colonial legacies, post-colonial desires, and alliances in the post-war decades. In other words, what we see expressed in the seemingly purely economic or pragmatic character of rapid industrial development are the earlier centre-periphery relations, what I've been referring to as colonial spacemaking, giving way to a new spatial relationship which exploits rather than resists the neo-colonial arrangement of global capitalism and US hegemony, but in the name of future national prosperity. It may be better then to describe that colonial space has less been unbuilt than transformed and reinscribed in the post-colonial period. And just to conclude, and my conclusion is titled Predicament and the Opportunity. To put what I've been arguing today in another way, Park Chung-hee's developing South Korea of the 1960s and 70s cannot be understood as merely a derivative or anomalous modernity, typically characterized by discourses of developmentalism, compressed modernity, Confucian capitalism, or, to invoke Kipnis again, beyond history. Rather, the post-colonial world's historical lack of resources, infrastructure, and colonies of its own, in short, the structural asymmetries of global development, mean that the processes and forms of urban growth here cannot simply replicate those of the imperial centre. As we have seen, primary among such determining conditions in South Korea is the hurried development enforced by a Cold War militarized state, which retains much of the colonial regime's instrumentalist view of space and populations, updated for the new international division of labour. From this perspective, post-coloniality seems less a shift to independent self-determination than a new management of the way labour power is produced and consumed by the developing nation. I've argued today for a more complicated understanding of the spatial systems of the Park Chung-hee era by examining them through the lens of post-coloniality. By looking at economic planning, literature, and political discourse, we can better understand the overlaid and contested inscriptions of spaces and urban forms, allowing us to consider how the space-making of colonialism and decolonisation are simultaneously overcome and redeployed for nationalist production. The post in post-coloniality thus indicates, as Wendy Brown has written, quote, a very particular condition of afterness, in which what is past is not left behind, but on the contrary, relentlessly conditions or even dominates the present, end quote. I've also implicitly argued that literary or discursive texts that foreground the built environment not only document their immediate physical changes, but also tell us about competing new and old relations, ideologies, and imaginaries that are deposited in architectural forms. This means we can view architecture in the built environment at once as products of historical processes and as integral figural or narrative elements in the ordering and retelling of these histories. Finally, as critic Pak Nak-chong has commented, the city of Seoul is an example of an unusually rapid and large-scale capitalist urbanization, yet with continuities inimical to it, still making claims for support and sustenance. Seoul makes a fit symbol of both the predicament and the opportunity. Thank you.
Okay, so I think we have an hour left. Thanks, Jenny. So for this discussion section, we have as moderators Professor Arunam Dutta. He's the Associate Professor of Architectural History on the other side of Cambridge at MIT, and Professor Kada Jayakit, Yoon Se-young Professor of Korean History here at Harvard. So I'll let you two lead the discussions, and then we'll have the Q&As from the audience. So maybe, Zach, you can start.
Okay, thank you very much. I really enjoyed both of these papers. I think they're both very important. I mean, as a historian of modern Korea, ever since I got into this profession, I have been stressing the importance of the colonial period, and that of course means post-colonial studies as well, because I really can't divorce them. But the trick is trying to parse out the connections and the influences, and I think both of our papers have made some wonderful points that lead us in that direction. I'm particularly glad that we do have a paper on post-colonialism as well as the colonial period. I think Sami's paper is particularly important for trying to break down this binary of the colonized and the colonizers, which has been too long a trope in the nationalist literature. And I particularly appreciate the fact that she has really tried to parse this out in a very empirical way, looking at the spaces of the city and the divisions that one finds in other colonialisms, for example, spatially, I think are much more fluid, actually blurred in the Korean case. And I would actually take what you have said even a little further, and I'm going to try to connect this then with the post-colonial paper, because what you were talking about in many ways was an attempt by the government general to create in Honmachi and other parts of the city a kind of mirror for Koreans to emulate, and to kind of coercive, subtle, but nevertheless form of control through what you call a kind of phantasmagoria of modernity. And I think that's true. I also think the idea of two temporalities there in Chon and Namchon also make a lot of sense. On the other hand, as you yourself point out, there was quite a bit of mixing going on, and I think this is sometimes underestimated in the colonial case. In the physical space, many Koreans were crossing over into Honmachi, going to the cafes, going into the stores. Of course, the Japanese were encouraging this to a great extent, as Simi was suggesting. But not just physical space. If you look at almost every aspect of colonial life, of business, music, art, you see Koreans involved very much in this world, this new world of modernity. And you see Koreans actually then going to Japan, like Chung-hee, the famous dancer, and sort of taking modernity and twisting it and adding Korean rhythms and images, and then performing for the Japanese. So it's not just completely one-dimensional. It really is going back and forth. I guess what I would stress here is the creativity of the Koreans, actually, that it's not just what's going on here is not just a form of Japanese control and coercion, which is very subtle and successful. The Koreans themselves are taking these new ideas and images, and they are themselves, if I dare say, overcoming colonial modernity in a sense, and creating a kind of modernity of their own, even in the language itself, the sort of dual language that you find. If you think of the famous novel by Imsun Sub, the Someday, Three Generations. It was written actually in Korean, of course, but he is writing about the Korean educated urban class, some of which has spent time in Japan. And there are whole scenes in that novel that take place in the Japanese language, where they switch just perfectly comfortably into Japanese in Homachi when they go into a cafe or something like that. And there's banter back and forth between the Koreans and the Japanese cafe girls. And then there's a kind of mixed language that takes place when they speak to each other, which is a mixture of Korean and Japanese. So what I'm getting at here is a constant process of negotiation, if you will. It's not just a top-down or even subtle form of coercion, but the Koreans themselves are their own agents here. Also, I would say that timing is important. I know you didn't talk about the wartime period, and that's fine, but I think actually you can't speak of the colonial period as a kind of homogeneous time period. And the war period is one in which, out of expediency because of the war effort, the government general sort of embraces the Koreans in a way they haven't before and opens the door in many respects to Koreans to participate in this modern world and at higher levels than was possible before, including in the military, which was denied to them before that. So here you have Koreans seizing the opportunity once again to, in a sense, overcome that colonial modernity and assert their own presence and identity in it. And this sort of moves me into the post-colonial era to some extent too, because I think when this happened, when the Koreans were given these opportunities or seized them, or in schools, in the art world, in athletics, in the military, they realized that they could do things as well as the Japanese. And in fact, they were often better at it in many respects. And that was an amazing sense of empowerment as well as frustration, because there was always that colonial ceiling. But at the same time, there was a sense that given the opportunity, we can do this too. And when finally the opportunity came in 1945 for Koreans to create their own world, I think this sense of we can do it better than the Japanese did it, if you will, was very much part of the post-colonial mentality, not just of Park Chung-hee, it was certainly there, but more generally of the population, which is one of the reasons that there was considerable support in the general population for the whole modernization project. And of course, the dark side of it was also part of the idea that we can do this. We can do it, but we do it at a certain price. And not everyone was willing to pay that price, but that was very much, I think, part of the mentality. So I think there is this very deep connection running between the colonial and the post-colonial. And I would, I guess, ask you to explore a little bit more deeply, precisely in the form of spatial configurations, what this means, particularly in the post-colonial paper, because you talk about the types of architecture to some extent, but I'm not quite sure how you're drawing the line with connecting the line with the colonial period. I'd like to hear more about that.
Thank you.
very much for the comment. Done a lot of notes, but I'll just say shortly about 3 comments. First of all, about Korean agency. So the question is, what do I do with such conceptualization of a city? So it is not the end, but it is only a means to envision different ways of resistance. So if we were to locate colonial power and the logic of colonial power in such a way, how do we talk about colonial resistance, as you pointed out? So far, that very question has been limited to the question of oppression and resistance. So instead of just looking for resistance, in the examples that you gave about Seoul and people crossing over, or Chung-hee actually going to metropolitan cities for performances, right? What I'm doing in my manuscript is to show that the very transgressive potential for Koreans lied in the fact that they could replicate the logic of colonial power in their own resistance. I don't know if it makes sense or not. But instead of locating resistance in outright rejection of modernity, or in search for traditions or timelessness, something that can be peculiarly Korean, we can also locate instances of resistance within the engagement with the very logic of power. So if I lay out the colonial power in such a way that the power rested upon the colonial subject, we can faithfully translate the image into discourse. We can also locate the fracture, friction and disjuncture in that process of translation. So I do actually move into the question of language. So instead of looking at the bifurcated space, in terms of bilingual city, the examples that you precisely mentioned about, colonial city being more ambiguous than the Japanese language, being used in Honmaji and Korean language being used in Korean district. For that, I actually look at signage, commercial signage, and the use of kanji, Chinese characters. And I was speaking kanji to learn that very distinction of bilingualism into heterolinguality. So, but when we look at wartime periods, I had to kind of stop in the late 1930s because it entails such very different questions, that you mentioned. And another thing about the urban space is that all this cosmopolitan facade of the architecture will be draped over during the wartime period with slogans, and so forth. So in a way, the urban space during the wartime period offers very interesting template to talk about Japan and Korea being one body, and that kind of corporeal assimilation can be also exhibited in the urban space, and how the urban space, the surface and matters change during that time. So if I am ambitious enough, and if I am capable enough, maybe that's the question that I would like to explore. What I like to do is kind of show the different energy that came before wartime period, because I felt that so much of colonial period has been dominated by the very assimilative logic of wartime period. So I can, if I can show a moment of possibility leading up to that period, maybe it's worth the effort. But thank you.
Thank you so much for your comments. They were really, really enlightening and helpful. I feel like I have a few responses. I don't know if they're going to coalesce in something coherent, but I guess one place to start for me is also I come primarily from postcolonial studies, or just and as a comparativist. One of the things that always struck me about South Korea is, of course, for most other postcolonial nations, the question of modernity is one that is something that is an ongoing struggle most often. And Korea, as well as the other Asian tigers, were exceptional in the third world for having achieved an incredible amount of development in a short time. So in fact, where other post-colonies often are dealing with their lack of development, for South Korea, one of the things I think that has been hard for a kind of national consciousness to deal with is actually the success. Where does that come from? And then you get into those sort of problematic places. Well, was it because of the Japanese? Well, we don't want to say that, right? Was it because of the Americans? And
don't want to say that either.
It wasn't that either, right? I'm going to be very unpopular. So I think one of the ways that I've attempted to sort of think through the problem is by thinking about the post-colonial response being conditioned by the kind of colonialism that happened. And I think we've heard some excellent papers on that. But I think you really get at the heart of it when you say that the Koreans realized particularly towards the end of the colonial period, that they could do just as well. And I think that also has to do with, of course, Japan's kind of unusual colonial status or imperial status as being, the neighboring country that had already had centuries of kind of relationships, a blurry sense of racial distinction that had to be invented. We know about that. So I think
that's a very good point.
So I think that in what you characterize as that response of we can do it better, actually manifests itself in a shared desire for modernization. And I guess what I was trying to articulate in my paper was the way that what's also unique about the Park Chung-hee period is that national space is what must be modernized for the nation to finally achieve itself or finally be realized. Okay? After the humiliation of being colonized and partitioned. So the idea, and that quote about the Sema Undong, I think is really interesting. So this idea that the Korean nation will finally appear on the world stage when we match everybody else, when we've matched Japan as in their level of modernity. And I think this comes out of the unique context of Korean colonial modernity, where in fact, as these papers have described, Seoul was this real showcase and experiment of modernity. So they were already embedded in it. So I think that's one answer.
Sammy, I think you're trying to get to a point which I think it's a very fascinating point, but I'm also struggling to understand it a little bit. And I don't think it's about articulating Korean agency. If I may describe it this way, I think you are sort of describing the modern, if you like, as already something like a postmodern. Tell me if I'm wrong, but what I understand you doing is laying out the modern as this sort of telos that goes from the past to the future. The past that is invoked, and you take the example of, which is the one that, which is sort of a staged past where you erase a lot of it, but you keep something in place, and therefore sort of, it sort of becomes, the past becomes its own spectacle. And then the future, is really sort of this, the modernist moment of, which is really the Platonic idea of self-examination, this idea of that you're able to self-reflect as a rational subject, and having come to the city, you acquire that kind of agency. But in self-reflecting, you recognize self-alienation in some ways, right? So, in other words, if there is so both past and future in some ways are, as you use the word, sort of simulacra. So any experience of agency, Korean agency or otherwise, would be sort of inauthentic in some ways. Is that the sort of setup that you're trying to lay out? I'm just trying to clarify that.
Okay. So the paper, the presentation that I gave today is, an attempt to understand the colonial logic, what was the intended or desired subjectivity, rather than, thinking about colonial subjectivity as such. So if we were to, look at colonial subjectivity, as, someone who would buy into that historical narrative or teleological history, but also deprived
of any historical agency because of that, the liminality that they have in that very tale of history. So, that's kind of conceptual, framework that I use in order to think about Korean agency or resistance, or I would actually prefer the term subjectivity in that very conundrum. So when we look at scholarship on colonial Korea, surprisingly enough, the 1920s and 30s, during cultural nationalism and so forth, the very question of resistance is absolutely complex and sometimes absent, because you cannot talk about resistance when cultural nationalists or urbanites are doing exactly the same thing that the Japanese are doing, right? They're arguing nation through the same trajectory of history, and the urbanites, urbanites in Seoul are talking about the city in the very same way that Japanese colonial discourse intended. So my question is, can we locate fissures, right, in that very logical power? And I actually it's kind of difficult to, this is kind of like 20% of my book, and it's difficult to explain 80% of my book. But I talk about, kind of a deconstructive effort of detaching those, semiotic interpretation of images into discourse. So I look at, very unstable grounds of in between layers of what I call surface matters, of visual layers, and auditory layers, and so forth. So, and I to make it short, yes, you're right. That's what I've been doing, but it's only a foundation. Yeah.
No, I think it's a fascinating idea that precisely if you accept the premise that sort of inhabiting any sort of formal form of agency is inherently inauthentic, then on some level it explains the struggles of power, because we never quite know what is it that we're fighting. So in order to fight the Japanese, you may actually end up being a kind of Japanese, if you like. So there's a sort of peculiar, because the antagonist or the counterforce never sits in place, so we find ourselves up in it. I think this is a very fascinating sort of understanding of power relations, but I don't know the rest of your book, but for me it then immediately begs some empirical breakdowns, where it's not, if we leave the story at the level of the quote-unquote Korean, I would ask, who's that? Within, and I think you also mentioned that, so, and I don't know if that's evident in the rest of your book, but for me that sort of immediately begs the question that there's no such thing as Korean, there's no such thing as Japanese, these are all narratives sort of clashing.
Respond to what you just said.
Yeah.
So, and I think
I have something to Genius book.
So I think so the problem with Korea and Japan vis-a-vis the West is that there's a difference. When these students were in Tokyo, they looked exactly like the Japanese students. And so this, we can do this but better, was really a problem. And I think it complicates the issue of agency as well. So I'm not going to talk much, but Korean students got better grades at Waseda University. Yet vis-a-vis the West, there was this slipperiness in terms of identity. So this issue of authenticity is something that Lee Kwang-soo is obsessed with. And I didn't want to say collaboration because then it ends up taking over the whole workshop, but he was the most famous collaborator. And he was the quintessential archetype of what Semi said. He claimed to be articulating identity and trying to save the Koreans by doing what the Japanese did, and that was his excuse for collaborating.
But I think that's so interesting, isn't it? Because it complicates the whole idea of what collaboration is, if you rethink it in those terms. And it calls for a rethinking of Lee Kwang-soo's own position, I think, based on what Semi is suggesting.
Well, Professor Kuriyama said it's not that he was a collaborator, but why is
the most famous Korean modernizer, the most famous modern nationalist, a collaborator? And why were 2 or 3 of them? So I think that is another way of looking at it.
think I'm jumping to a different topic, but I'm adding to, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing your name
It's
right.
okay. Pronounce it. I'm pretty sure I'm mispronouncing yours as well. So.
What is the correct pronunciation?
Arindam.
Arindam.
Say that guy.
So, I agree, it's a thought-provoking paper, but I also have the same issues that Professor Arindam raised, because the colonial experience was very different. We did talk a bit about class and gender, but it was very different whether you lived in the countryside or whether you were educated in the Japanese, what would you say, Futsugakko, the elementary education system, or whether you were educated by missionaries, or whether you were a kiseng or a factory worker or a poor farmer. And so I always tell family stories, and my parents don't like it, but both my parents grew up in the colonial period. I'm dating myself, but my father was educated straight through the Japanese education system. And my mother's, and he was from Daegu, which was the center of the agricultural production, and Professor Carter has written about it too. And so my grandfather, my father's father, was in business with the Japanese. And he thought the empire was going to last forever. So he had bought land in Manchuria and refused to sell till the very end, and he kind of lost it at the end. And my mother's family, they were ginseng merchants in Kaesong, which they refused to collaborate, and Kaesong was known for being very independent, wily merchants. And so he had money, and he sent all his children to missionary schools. So my mother's Japanese is no good, but my father's Japanese is elegant. Even now, he's in his 80s. And what was funny is when I was growing up, when they want to talk about family secrets, just like the novel, they would lapse into colloquial Japanese. So I always said, one day I'll grow up and learn Japanese to find out what all these secrets are. And so that is my excuse to learn Japanese and get into this period. So as I was saying, there are many, many levels of experience by class, gender, and educational level, and then the layers of power. So my experience reading about the project of Southgate to redevelop it into a major urban space, I read many, different sides. So the Seoul city municipal officials wanted to make it into their own vision of what it would be. But in the process, they were clashing with the transportation tram company. They were clashing with the Japanese settlers who had become very successful merchants in the marketplace. And then they were clashing with the Korean vendors who were street vendors. So this goes on all the time in a capitalist economy, just like Professor Watson said in her paper. And so they were not all for bulldozing the middle of the gate. That was a great area where they did all their business. And so the marketplace was completely moved. So I think we cannot have that kind of totalizing effect, and also the use of images that Professor Oh has used. I think you have to be very careful, as I said in my research. Many of the postcards were produced by exposition committees, by the transportation industry, by the merchants and the companies who are promoting each of their own agendas in these different sites and spaces in Seoul, and also at different time periods. And these images were recycled. Some of the images are 40 years old, and they're recycling it in the media. So you have to know who is making these postcards, where they were selling, and for what event. So, being a much older scholar, it's just a word of caution when you approach these kinds of images and material sources and visual sources. It has to be a very fine, eye and calculation. I think Carter and Arindam probably.
Actually, had a question for Jeannie. If there's a different kind of Indian sitting in my place here, he or she would be saying, like, what are you complaining about? in other words, actually,
I was going to ask that.
yeah. Well, let me phrase it better. I mean,
That's about phrase.
no, there is the problem. There's a real analytical problem here, and that's what I mean by phrase it better. Is that actually this Vivek Chipper's book? I don't know if any of you read it. It's called Locked in Place. It actually compares the South Korean and Indian case of post-independence industrialization. So it's actually this is a business case study. So if you look at the average right-wing current Indian, they point to the tiger, the Asian tigers, and and for them those countries are successes because the state was able to cow the working class, etc., the democratic whatever, which basically is now seen as having handicapped India because we're too democratic and so on and so forth. So the state was able to coerce the population in order to move it towards better development, higher income, blah, 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 GDP, etc. Right? Now, what is fascinating is that, and Chipper's book is an example, is that the Marxists follow the same story except they use it the other way, which is to argue that in the case of South Korea or Singapore and so on and so forth, the state was able to coerce the industrial class, the chaebols, in order to deliver on their export obligations after having made huge investments in capital goods, which was imported from elsewhere. So, and this is what sort of failed in India, is because in India the industrial class, when the state sort of gave them subventions in the form of capital goods, which sort of adversely affected the balance of payments, because it meant dollars, right? The industrial class effectively reneged on their export obligations, and what they did was turn around and capture the domestic market instead. So therefore, the balance of payments got progressively worse, sort of putting India into several cycles of IMF and so on and so forth, right? So we, in other words, how do I put it in the form of a question? And what's fascinating now, by the way, is that a lot of Indian infrastructure is being built now by South Korean firms. Right. All the highways, the Delhi metro, and so this is a sort of cheap industrializing power that, as opposed to, let's say, I don't know the Dutch, I don't know who we take as a counterexample.
They compete with the Japanese for the railways.
Well, that's true, and so it's sort of the same product, it's a little cheaper, and etc. So there's a sort of fascinating story here. I mean, Timothy and I are part of a group that really tries to think of architecture in relationship to the problem, or the era of what we call global development. And here, even your example of Korea as not having a real sort of nostalgia for the past. I mean, this is also very true of China. I mean, Mao. I mean, basically, Mao kills the preservationist movement and really picks up in the 1990s when Clinton goes. There's a picture of him in Chelsea in that, whatever. So, anyway, so I think, I don't know what my question is, but I think it's interesting to, maybe I can phrase it better, but I think it may be important to situate the sort of story that you're saying in terms of the broader rubrics of economic agency, how power was constituted, and so on and so forth. It turns out that the Johnson administration, for instance, tried to intervene in India, but they failed because they were so inefficient, as opposed to Korea, where they were, and sort of Korea did realize. So there's a sort of broader global development story here that, because these cases always are being compared, and you're doing the comparison to Japan, and I can hear that, but there's a lot of, there's a sort of broader global discourse that's not just localized here, and that needs to also somehow kept in play. Sorry, maybe you can phrase my question better.
No, I would just very quickly expand the question for everyone here, and that's I think a larger question about post-colonial studies, which have tended to assume, I think, an absolutely negative view of colonialism. And there's certainly many negative aspects of colonialism. No one is going to deny that. And yet when you put it in this kind of context, other questions rise to the surface. The nature of Japanese colonialism as opposed to British colonialism, for example. So, I mean, there is a really interesting dimension here about post-colonial studies and the implicit assumptions that they carry. in the field.
Thank you very much for the great, very provocative comments. I suppose I should say I'm not, I'm certainly not complaining about development of Korea. I think I'm just...
You're not complaining about colonialism?
No, I think I'm trying to get out of that situation where you either have to thank the colonizers for doing some, initial infrastructure development or those sorts of arguments, but I think the placement in a broader development narrative is really important, because what I also think of what I'm trying to do, or what I've tried to do in the book, was really explain a moment when, and this is the way Samir Amin describes it, a moment when the third world starts differentiating itself, right? Into an industrializing third world, and then what perhaps we might call the fourth world, or often Africa or indigenous groups or something like that. So to me that was a really interesting problematic to tackle, and I think what I was really trying to think against were the narratives of simply the success stories of Asian tigers. It's amazing. I don't know people in this room, but it's amazing how many people still don't have any idea that there was a dictator or that there was a democracy struggle. Partly that's because North Korea has overshadowed the dictatorship story of the peninsula. That's it. But I think these are actually precisely really important questions. One thing I should just say, Park Chung-hee certainly did manage, as you say, the business class with an iron fist. He directly told businessmen what to invest in. You do this, if you don't, you go to jail. So he did have that. So
and he mentioned that he had a liberal beginning, which is sort of self-interesting.
Well, I think he very cleverly played on a desire for a kind of a nationalist self-realization that hadn't happened, and of course the Syngman Rhee years were sort of devolving into terrible corruption and kind of neo-colonialism. So I think he sort of tapped into that and then turned around and sort of behaved in this very autocratic but very efficient and productive manner. But the other side of the story, I think, is also the innovation of export industrialization. And I think we forget now, because of the way that China and India and Southeast Asia and a lot of other places are following that model, that in fact for the Asian tigers who sort of pioneered it, that was pretty new. And in the 50s and 60s, the development economists, thank you, were still advocating import substitution as a model. So what's interesting is that Park Chung-hee very quickly and cannily turns the nationalist project to one not about developing industries for domestic consumption, but in fact developing them for export consumption. And I think that's also where also the ideology of space comes into it, because this national space is really seen as a circulatory body for getting labour products together, and the city becomes more of a platform for production than anything else. So I do think for him there was a very canny manipulation of national space that went along with that.
I'll add only one little detail. Okay. Is that we have to remember that South Korean industrialization was an outpost of Japanese export led industrialization. So it was really Japanese capital coming into South Korean capital, into South Korean space, and then it was an outsourcing of capacity that was sort of being worked out, and that's also in itself a very interesting.
And a Cold War strategy, right? To have this against the North.
I think this is in a way more a speculation or observation, but it'll end as a question that actually I think is towards the whole group, or towards the larger claims that are laid out here. The image that you showed of Ginny, that you showed of the grand complex of the kind of arch or gateway over the dirt road, I was struck there just by a purely visual resonance with the images of the South Gate. And in particular, the way the first image that you showed of the South Gate as a kind of more, an object more organically embedded within the city is then transformed into a curated object within the city. And then in seeing the visual resonance, the question I was posing in my head was, should I understand that last image as a gate? And I think I should, yes. But then, should I understand it also as something, once again, organically rooted, not within a purely economic system or a political economic system? Or should I see it as a curated image in the way that you were describing this as an attempt to actually produce a representation of a new city, but then it somehow not falls apart, but turns into this other thing, this kind of shanty town. So rather than try to answer that as a yes or no, I think that what I'm struck by in all the papers and in the comments that they provoked is, if I might have come into the conversation assuming that I would read those three images as a easy narrative of modernization, so going from the organic city to a kind of self-conscious city into a purely economic city, see again a teleology of those things, that in all of the papers, because, and the conversation, because there has been no counter-narrative or no accompanying narrative of uprooting, of disruption, of the break that we associate with the Western first world narrative of first modernization, that I'm struck by maybe what you've proposed is actually a portrait of modernity and modern space as actually a problem. I'm thinking of it as a problem, but maybe just as a kind of experience of knowing, and an attempt to actually inhabit a space, as opposed to an attempt to continually produce a new space. So maybe I can rephrase it in a more lucid way. It's not, the descriptions that you offered do not describe the destruction of an old space, the replacement of it with a new space, so much as they describe a continuous present, a present of a spatial present of the city of Seoul, and these narratives of attempts to inhabit that space, attempts to come to terms with it. But in none of those narratives do you seem to suggest that there is a prior space that was somehow familiar, that was somehow known, that was somehow, and this I think comes through most strongly in your account, where you're arguing that there's always a conflation, there's always a kind of confusion of these elements. There's not an origin being substituted by a future, but always these kind of continuous presence. So this isn't perhaps a question, but I'm phrasing it as a question. Is it the case that the description of modernity that's being offered here is not the narrative, the familiar narrative of modernization being the process of disruption and destruction and replacement by some other thing, as it is actually always an organic city, that in each of these cases there's a fully organic city that is a reflection of its economy or its politics, but is not actually an image of supersession, of one thing being removed and another thing coming into its place. And maybe this would be, as Arina pointed out, the idea of the modern being already postmodern. You know, this is the way it's described by a number of Latin American theorists. The process of modernization is described as already postmodern. There is no Latin American modernity. There's only Latin American postmodernity. And in this case, it would be, trying to not replace, but step aside from the narrative of modernity as progress, development, disruption, destruction, and put in its place something else, which is this kind of postmodern, a continuous postmodern. So would that be the model, theoretically, the model that I should be using as I kind of understand or approach the material that you've presented to us, as opposed to trying to associate this with a kind of narrative of development?
Was it? I don't know, I feel like temporality is you. That's you. I think that was a very, very rich comment there. Thank you. I think I'm not sure my own work has articulated the spatial movement in terms of the postmodern in the way that you have. I think in my reading of this period for under Park Chung-hee and the post-war period more generally, I do think of it in terms of I think the paradigms of modernity fit at best in my own thinking. However, and in terms of, I think, architectural style, and I just mentioned, as an aside, a sort of Corbusian desire for sort of re-engineering the built environment and creating a new kind of social consciousness. But I'm careful about when I use the term modernity, because I also don't want, I really want to avoid those sort of discourses of belated modernity and derivative modernity. But what I think, when I think of, that's why we also have to think of the colonial and post-colonial together. I mean, my sort of understanding, one of my working definitions of the post-colonial modernity is the attempt to, especially in South Korea, is the attempt to overcome the subordinated status of being the colonized in a system where the imperial center, where you were already the support for the imperial center. Do you see what I'm saying? I'm not saying it very clearly. But it's not simply, it's like the colonies and the peripheries have already played such a central role in the modernity of the West. So that the post-colonial transformations and realizations of modernity are not simply belated, but they're a transformation of a different dimension, right? I think in terms of I guess we can think about, I think that, temporality is probably the place to think more about maybe the postmodern and the ongoing ever newness of cities, and the title of my book is The New Asian City, which of course really speaks to that effort to constantly renew space. But in fact, what I describe in the end is that there's nothing really new about that. These are all sort of dialectic. All these efforts are dialectically produced from older and continuing forces. So I'm going to hand it over to
I don't know if this would be a good way of answering your question, but when you talk about the uprootedness in modernity, maybe we can think of modernity as a process of uprooting as well. And I actually heavily rely on Koselleck's, concept of modernity as music, the new time. The modernity itself has a self-articulation that distinguishes itself from what came before and arranges the historical periods as a sequential manner that arrives at what is distinctively new and different of what preceded it. So instead of talking about modernity as a condition or developmental trajectory, if we look at modernity as an epistemological structure that has a very distinctive self-articulation of what it is, we are, drawing, from this, very impetus of uprooting everything that is local and subsuming and foreclosing everything under the logic of modernity. So that's how I wanted to locate colonial discourse, and also think about colonial subjectivity in such a way, going back to the question of agency, historical agency. If we were to lump people in the categories of gender, age, region, and so forth, that's also replicating the very logic of colonial control, because that's how they identify the colonial subjects. So just as we free modernity, from this idea that is a historical stage, but an epistemological structure, we can also kind of free the very idea of colonial subjectivity and endow them with some creative and transgressive potentials, and in fixing modernity in such a way. So in a way, this is a conceptual exercise, rethinking what modernity is, rethinking what colonial subjectivity is, And in my own presentation, I also try to uproot those images from the very source where they came from and put them in montage in such a way the historical continuity of time and space will be all disarranged and uprooted, but will be reborn into something else that may not be recognizable to some, but also will reflect the very condition of modernity that is uprooting and subsuming.
We can open it up to questions from the
audience.
Let me bring the focus back to a particular building that was mentioned frequently
Put the mic closer.
in the conversations this afternoon. That's the old government general building. When the campaign to destroy it was launched, Shin Yong-ha was perhaps the spearhead of that campaign. And Shin Yong-ha is a former historian at SMU. And here I were having a dinner on the campus in Seoul. And I said to him that nobody in India has ever thought of demolishing any British era buildings.
No, the Hindu right did in the 90s. Yeah.
In the 90s?
Yeah, that was part of a movement that actually had to resist them. But yes, those.
But it never really went anywhere, right?
No, it was very powerful.
But I mean,
We were pretty scared.
did any particular building get destroyed?
All the Delhi, in Rajpath, the Lutyens' umbrellas and so on and so forth. There was.
The old buildings are still there.
No, but they tried to.
They tried to, yeah, that's a different matter. I mean, there's a nativist movement, of course, and it has led to the renaming of cities like Madras is Chennai, Bombay is Mumbai, Calcutta is Kolkata, and Pondicherry is Puducherry. But on the other hand, you have the Victoria Memorial in Calcutta, still very much alive, a tourist spot. You have the King George Medical College in the city of Lucknow. And the entire core city of New Delhi, not the new suburbs, but the core city of New Delhi, was built by the British with a blueprint from Washington, D.C. actually. And I have wondered about the reasons why that kind of emotional reaction has not taken place in India, except in some nativist quarters, as you mentioned. Ultra-nationalist elements certainly exist there, but it hasn't really caught on. And my own tentative answer to this has been that the British architecture in India oftentimes incorporated Indian elements. The monumental architecture of the British has some very fine incorporation of traditional Indian architecture. And at the emotional level, maybe that's the answer. But at the political level, it may be because the British left in a manner quite different from the way the Japanese left Korea. So I wonder if people have thoughts about this. And, maybe you, as a historian, you can throw more light on this.
I think the second option is the case. It's not only that the left in a different manner, but if you look at the particular conditions of decolonization in India in the 90s, it's right after the Second World War. The Labour Party wins in England, and they have the mandate that India is going to become free, and then the Indian ruling class is very complicit with the left in England. So you have Fabians like Nehru and so on and so forth. So it's one of a fascinating example of a negotiated transfer of power, where basically even for the first 5 years of Indian rule, the military is controlled by English generals. This is unique because in Africa the leftover remnants of the colonial armies will capsize the potential of sovereignty. I mean, Congo is the classic example. I mean, where Lumumba gets, So it's a very particular. Mossadegh in Iran doesn't suffer the same fate. So India is actually it's so-called. I mean, it's sort of unfortunate that Indian post-colonial writers are so followed in so-called post-colonial studies, but India is actually unique. It's the only example, and it stands out from all the broader counterexamples that are available in the world. So I think, so in other words, I think you're right, but that was also because the Indian ruling class was so complicit ideologically with the English ruling class, and that sort of accounts for some of this.
What about the architectural elements? Indian architecture?
Sure.
Can I throw some light on that?
Questions?
On a different topic, that's okay. I was intrigued by the couple of brief mentions about America in the papers. Ellie, I think you talked about a character who was thinking about going off to the U.S. for school, and the question of U.S. hegemony and global capitalism that Park is dealing with. But the larger conversation has been so much on the sort of Korea-Japan binary, which makes sense. But I'm wondering, does it make sense? Is it productive to think about the U.S. in the colonial spatial system or the colonial imaginary? Is that in any way productive? I know that film historians have talked about Hollywood films actually financing the censorship, the Japanese censorship bureaucracy with the fees they paid. So sort of supporting the colonial project in that way. And other cultural historians have written about the popularity of American music or dance or fashion as an alternative model of modernity that young people could embrace, being modern without being Japanese. And I'm wondering is it worthwhile to bring America in to kind of unsettle that binary of Korea and Japan? And is it productive to do that? And if so, can that help move away from terms like authenticity and collaboration that tend to assume that it's possible to separate colonizer and colonized into neat categories, and that you can say who's a collaborator and who isn't, and more towards terms of transnationalism or hybridity that kind of muddy that neat distinction of colonizer and colonized?
Wow, a big question. I'm just going to answer in historical specifics. So I remember reading somewhere that Teddy Roosevelt, after the Anglo-Japanese alliance was signed in 1902, right?
That's right.
That he thought the Japanese were cool because they were the samurai amongst the yellow races. And he said, let them join the old boys club, because if they can become that cool as the samurai, I'm paraphrasing, but this isn't just what he said.
I don't think he used the word cool.
I'm just trying to this is, and so, of course, in self-orientalizing themselves, it was one of the ways that the Japanese captivated the New York Empire imagination. And so there are accounts of, for example, Harper's Bazaar articles about the Japanese colonization of Korea. And so the US were complicit and condoned and allowed Japan to take over. And of course, the trusteeship from 1905 to 1910. You're asking such a big question. And in many ways, and I tried to talk about this in my paper, and Semi talks about it too, in this notion of replication and layering, the Japanese negotiated modernity. So in many ways, and you see this in translations of intellectual texts. Thomas Carlyle, a British writer, was translated into Japanese first. Then he was translated into Chinese by Nash Chow. And it was because Nash Chow wrote in classical Chinese that the Koreans were able to read Thomas Carlyle. So you can see the transference of this thing called modernity and the layers. So those are two historically specific examples that I can give without answering the question in an ambiguous, sloppy way.
So I want to echo what Ellie said. By the late 19th century, the West had basically reached a consensus that Japan was the most deserving. So there was a triple threat on Korea in the late 19th century. and it was China, Russia, and Japan. And so they had the Sino-Japanese War between 1894 and 95, and that's when Japan fought in Korea and Manchuria, and they took over Taiwan and part of Manchuria. And in the Russo-Japanese War, they basically creamed, they're going to use contemporary words, they creamed the Russians, sank the whole Pacific Fleet. And that led to a revolution even in Russia. And so by the early 20th century, Japan was recognized as the de facto power. So after that, the Westerners, the only Westerners who stayed, who were brave enough, were the American missionaries. So you can say in terms of education, that's why the Koreans are probably the most educated and Christianized. So in that sense, you can say that American influence remains very strong. So after and the Japanese finally kicked out the missionaries, and they had to leave in the 30s. But the revenge is Korea now is the most Christianized country in Asia, outside of the Philippines, and they're Catholics, so that don't count. So now the Koreans send more missionaries. I think the Koreans send even more missionaries than American missions around the world, right? Yeah, the biggest church in LA has like 30,000 people attending. They have to broadcast it. It's over freeway. So in that sense, American influence, American education, American ideas of democracy came in. And I'm glad she mentioned film. So in the 1940s, with the American occupation period, although it was brief, it was intense. And now we have American troops still stationed there since 1945, right? So we have, I don't know how many, 1950,
They
right?
left and came back.
Right, after the Korean War. So because it's classified, we don't know how many American bases there are, but there are all these American bases with American camps where the first Korean musicians learned jazz, learned the blues, watched American film, danced the go-go, and the people who study the Korean wave said that's why the Koreans are so in tune with American pop music to this day. So in that sense, you can say the American influence is strong. And I just want to mention one thing that Professor Chandra mentioned. Why is it so emotional in Korea and that they had to destroy this great piece of architecture? And they didn't do that in Taiwan. You know, the Taipei Sotokufu is still standing. They did not do it in Shanghai on the Bund. They did not do it in Vietnam. And I can't, in the last chapter of my book in 2000, I picked out three forces. The first is the pre-colonial past. So when they built this Sotokufu, they built it right in front of the main palace gates. And I don't think conquerors have done this before. I think the Romans have done this before. But it was, it was a monument to show that we are now in power. And then in the post-colonial period, this building was used by MacArthur during the colonial occupation as his headquarters. Then in the next generation, Chung-hee, after the coup, used it as his headquarters. And then in 1986, to prepare for the Korean 88 Olympics, the whole interior, because it was a very vast interior, they transformed it into the National Museum. So for 10 years, it was the National Museum of Korea. And that's why the Korea's most valuable treasures was there. And the main reason why they changed into the National Museum, they said it was centrally located, transportation is great, and then it's much cheaper than building a new museum somewhere. And you know, Seoul has a space, there's not enough empty space. And so when the Shinyohas of this world, the right-wing national historians, in 1994, the debate started in 1992. They said, we have to destroy this monument, and the rhetoric was, I guess, powerful because it was the 50th anniversary of the independence. So the rhetoric was 일제, 잔재, 청산. It means to uproot the remnants of Japanese colonial memories. And so their main argument was, first, it was in front of the royal palace, and second was, it was destroying the feng shui of Seoul as a monarchical Confucian capital. But you know, the stupid thing is, the feng shui was destroyed long time ago. But, so that was it. So they said, because the feng shui was destroyed, it's bringing misfortune to Seoul. So they hopped back to this entirely Confucian, ritualistic, religious argument. And so...
and that it was in the form of ilcha.
Right. And so the courtyard of the building was, they said, the form of il, or the Japanese nippon, ichi. And so the dome that was decapitated and some of the columns saved in the Independence Hall museum, I went to visit it, and they reburied it in a little park. And so, thank you.
Are there any more questions from the audience?
We have to closing comments.
I've been asked to wrap up and quickly, so let's see if I can do that. I'll just quickly go through the 4 papers that we looked at today. Hyung-il Pai's paper looked at the reconstruction of colonial subject relations as evidence to the technological medium of photography. She looked at relations between different subjects, Western travelers, particularly women travelers, the aristocracy, Japanese patronage, and so on and so forth. She looked at their views of peasants, children, courtesans, minors, marginalized as opposed to royals and dignitaries who were sort of instantiating the different skeins of power. She looked at different media, travelogues, government reports, photo albums, postcards, travel guides. She particularly focused on the work of 3 such photographic accounts, Percival Lowell from Boston, Isabella Bird, and George Rose. She made the argument that the preservation of the Korean past as evidenced in the photography sort of had as I understand it, had a certain kind of paradox. And on the one hand, it was felt that nothing in the Korean past was worth preserving. On the other hand, there was this act of preserving that happened in the very moment of sort of relegating the past, as it were. So the isolated monuments, she talks about the Wongkak-shaji pagoda, which became Pagoda Park, and then the Southgate examples. Both of them become these sort of peculiarly contrapuntal examples of the history that is sort of both being invoked and being erased at the same time. So that's sort of, if I may encapsulate the argument that way. Ellie Choi spoke of this idea of the organic minjuk as narrated in Lee Kwang-soo's novel *The Heartless*. And again here, she spoke to yet another kind of paradox, which is the organicity of what has been lost. But this organicity that Lee Kwang-soo recovers, he can only do so by passing through the metropole. So the non-metropolitan can only be recovered through the metropolitan, through a metropolitan sensibility. She examines this through various kinds of chronotropes in the novel, the novella called *Heartless*. She points out that the protagonist within the novel mimics many features of Lee Kwang-soo's own travel into the metropole and around. She points out the different use of topoi, geographic topoi, and so on and so forth in the novel, and this triangulation between Pyongyang, Seoul, and Tokyo. There's something very, I would say, Austenian, like Jane Austen, or Dickensian, if you like, in these sort of various class and gender hierarchies, the rich father-in-law, the rich lover, the poor ex-lover, and so on and so forth. Also the protagonist's envy of these supposedly free but also sort of obstreperous students who seem to be denying the modern order that he seems welling up within himself. If I may, there's one very interesting counterpart to this kind of story of leaving the past behind in the figure of a woman, and then the sort of heartlessness that's involved. In India, the a Bengali example is Vibhuti Bandyopadhyay's Apu, the Pather Pachali, which was made by Satyajit Ray into the Apu trilogy, and in the second one of them, which is by far the most depressing of the three, it's literally Apu leaves his mother behind and refuses to come back to the village. There's a sort of heartlessness by which his mother dies pining for him to come back to the village and sort of care for her and so on and so forth. So it seems to me that this leaving behind is sort of a very interesting trope to follow. I was also personally interested in the figure of rape, and that's absolutely critical here. Ellie was followed by Semi. Semi's paper sort of really looked at the cultural imaginary, these kinds of these phantasmatic terrains of Hanmachi and Chongno and Ginza, and she argued that that these terrains are not, as urban centers, are not centers in the classic sense, in that political power emanates from there, but rather as a terrain of desire. So power here operates not by excluding, which is the sort of traditional political idea of like you belong or you don't belong, but by including. So a power only can exist by making you want that condition, which she further argues is actually, if I understand her correctly, is sort of this inauthentic telos of agency. She uses people like Timothy Mitchell to argue her case. Jenny Kim Watson also sort of makes similar arguments. This kind of desubstantialization of the city, if you like, when she argues that the government, on the one hand, there's the Governor General's building or the traditional markers of colonial modernity, banks, railway stations, so on and so forth. But she distances herself from that analysis to take up Henri Lefebvre's argument about space as an abstract, but inhabited by narratives and so on and so forth. But the Cartesian or Marxist underpinnings of Lefebvre, I believe, allows her to talk about space as opposed to architecture as a sort of divisible entity, such that you can mark out class divisions and so on and so forth, manifested in her example, or in the story that she provides, a little ball launched by a dwarf, and the opposition between the new apartment complexes and on the other hand the slums. She also talks about Park Chung-hee's use of the economy and sort of the fear of recession to coerce workers into compliance in favor of an export-led economy as the mechanism for ensuring global parity. So on some level, post-coloniality comes across as a new form of labor management, if I understand it correctly. And she also pointed out the new village movement, where again, it's not just the city, but even the rural periphery can be brought under the domain of the new technocratic center. So if I were to sort of generally encapsulate, I'm going to do this very quickly, sort of the broad brunt of all the talks that we saw today, I will say that they broadly follow a sort of Lacanian structure of identity politics, if you like, which is to say the structure of specular alterity, the self mirrored in the other as the sort of always inadequate figure that struggles to come to an authentic sense of itself. So we saw a lot of binaries today, and a chain of binaries. So there's West and Japan and Korea, Hanmachi, North Village, Seoul, Pyongyang, and the chain just goes on and on and on. So it's interesting that Semi actually, no, it was Eddie who sort of, at some point you had to sort of diagram it all out, and it almost came close to a Grimus semiotic diagram where you sort of, you almost got a square. That would have been sort of interesting if that happened. And the Semi sort of points out that there's a kind of...
Sorry, Arindam, we have a student thing on every Friday.
Oh, I know. Happy hour. I went here, So.
But we have our own happy hour that's supposed to start like now.
Okay, so I'll just take a few minutes and we'll be done. So Ellie talks about configuration between these multiple axes, and Semi, on the other hand, talks about simulacra or simulation. But I would only point out that we have to remember that even the cities of Europe and America are also part of such simulacra. I mean, America apes England, England apes the Roman Republic, so that the city centers have these Cleopatra's Needles or Trajan's columns. I mean, constantly there's a sort of a path that constantly keeps re-emerging. My final thought, I think if I were to be critical of the papers, I would say that broadly speaking, all the papers were sort of brave in trying to move power, the study of power from the constitutive to the performative. It's not in place, but it operates in a certain way. And they all pointed to different performative narratives, right? But then here perhaps I can bring up the question of architecture. I know none of you are sort of familiar with the architectural idiom, but you all sort of bravely sort of try to have a go at it, which is very much appreciated. But I think the real question is not about architecture, but the real question is sort of the form or the genre of how narratives are voiced. In other words, it was sort of very fascinating. There are certain moments in each of your analysis that I found really fascinating and were sort of covered over to establish the broader argument. I think with Colonial, I sort of pointed out that photograph, a weird photograph. Jeannie Kim Watson sort of talks about the novel that she talks about. It has a deceptively simple, rhythmic Korean, which is stunted and incomplete. And Ellie talks about the narrative as sort of awkward and uncomfortable. So there's something about, and this, as somebody who doesn't read Korean, and you're telling me something about the meter of how prose is being written. There's a sort of speed of the text, the kinds of how figure is used. I mean, what are they using? Parataxis, metaphor? Are they using telegraphic sentences? And so on and so forth, which tells you, is the genre a realist genre? It's one thing to say, to sort of talk about what the narrative is talking about. It's another thing to talk about how a narrative performs, which would be to ask, like, why is realism such a favorite trope of cinema in Italy in the 1950s, precisely under the Marshall Plan and so on and so forth. So the study of the form of the narrative, for me, is really the entry point, which could probably bring us to art history or architecture, because that's the sort of erased layer. And the problem or the risk here is that by not being attentive to the form, you probably, there's a danger in looking at the literary narrative as a direct witness to the anthropological, as sort of the direct witness to the original experience. So I think with that, I'll stop.
Thank you, Arunda. So everyone, we have a reception planned, and room 122 and 123. It's Korean food and wine.
Oh, good.
So I've been told the two don't go well together, but you guys can be the judge.
Before we move away, as a director of Korea Institute, I'd like to really thank Melanie for bringing all these scholars with different disciplines come together and talk together. So thank you, Melanie, so much. And also, I'd like to thank two faculty advisors here, Timothy Hyde and Yuki. Thank you so much.